Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining today's live stream. This is a Tuesday live stream we host every week on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and we cover all things related to digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And the topic of today's live stream is ChatGPT and OpenAI. What are the data privacy and legal issues? So in other words, we're going to talk about the dark side of ChatGPT and OpenAI. We will also talk about the positive things, but we also want to really focus on some of the hidden risks and things that people may not be thinking about as they embrace and get excited about ChatGPT, OpenAI, and other AI technologies that are becoming quite in vogue and mainstream here lately. I'll introduce our guest here in just a moment, but before we do that, a couple logistical things. First of all, this live stream interview is going to be edited and polished and added to additional content to become part of next week's episode of Transformation Ground Control, which is a weekly podcast that I host that's released every Wednesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, where it streams every Wednesday. And on Wednesdays, you can also find those same episodes in the audio formats on Google, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, etc. The podcast platforms, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find it there. So be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you don't. It's called Transformation Ground Control. You can find it on podcast platforms all over the place, as well as streaming on the platforms I mentioned. Secondly, we are going to start with some questions that I have for our guest here today to talk about some of the legalities and data privacy and dark side issues of ChatGPT and OpenAI. But I'd also love to hear your questions as well. So I want to make sure that we get to audience questions here throughout the conversation. So at any point we're talking here, we've got an eye here on the streams that we're streaming to. And so we're watching the chat stream here. So please drop in the chat any questions you have along the way. And speaking of the chat stream here, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat wherever you're watching today. If you don't mind just dropping in the chat where in the world you're joining from, what city and country are you in? This is a global reach and a global audience that we typically are talking to every Tuesday. And we'd love to hear where everyone's joining from here today, especially because this topic is very much an international topic, and there's legalities and nuances that are probably different in different parts of the world. So we'd love to hear where people are joining from here today. So please drop that in the chat, and we'd love to hear where you're from. So again, topic today, ChatGPT and OpenAI. What are the data privacy and legal issues? Best person I can think of to have this conversation is someone that we've had multiple times on the podcast, on this live stream. It is Marcus Harris from Taft Law. So Marcus, thank you for being here today.
Hey, Eric, it's good to see you again. I appreciate you inviting me on to talk about this. And like you said, I mean, this is an evolving world of really innovation and impact. And I think, the legal implications are pretty critical to have an understanding of, especially, I mean, I look at this from two perspectives. One is just from a consumer perspective, wanting to know what the legal implications are, kind of play out those risks and look at how, this is going to impact you and what kind of legal constraints there are with respect to AI. And then I look at it from an enterprise perspective and figure out, look, what are the benefits? What are the use cases? How do you mitigate risk? And how do you exploit this technology to really gain some efficiencies on the corporate, ERP, big data, big software side?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said at the intro of this discussion, this is such a hot topic right now, and there's so much excitement around it, so much curiosity around it. OpenAI and ChatGPT are things that are mentioned in mass media, pop culture. Recent episode of South Park, which is a popular U.S. comedy, animated comedy, even had a whole episode dedicated to ChatGPT. So you start to look at these signals that people are really interested in this topic. And so we thought it'd be kind of cool to talk about, we want to temper some of the enthusiasm about the technology, not to suggest it's not a good technology or it won't totally transform the way we do business, but we also need to recognize the risks and the potential dark side of ChatGPT, OpenAI. And by the way, I'll keep talking about ChatGPT and OpenAI, but really this whole conversation relates to any AI model, generative AI that's out there. So Google has their own version of Bard. Microsoft has a Copilot, which is something that it's a little bit different, but they've introduced that as part of their Office 365 suite, or I think they're beta testing it now. And Microsoft is also a investor in OpenAI. Elon Musk is investing in his own platform for sort of an OpenAI type of model. So we're talking about ChatGPT, OpenAI, but we'll sort of use that as a universal term to describe what we're discussing here today, and it applies to all sorts of AI. But just to start, I guess, one thing that maybe just to set the context for the discussion here, we won't go into a ton of detail of what ChatGPT is and what OpenAI is, but we do have some resources on our YouTube channel that you can go to if you want to learn more about it. In fact, I'll ask our marketing team to drop it in the chat here, some links to recent discussions. I put out a brief video just yesterday on my YouTube channel that just gives an overview of ChatGPT. And we also, a few weeks ago on this same live stream, we had a discussion around what ChatGPT is and what it can do and the ways it's affecting businesses and the way we do business. So we'll drop those links in the chat so you can learn more about what the platform is. So today we want to focus on sort of the like I said, the dark side of this. And just to set the context, I'll kind of open it up by talking about a poll that I published on LinkedIn just yesterday, actually. So we haven't gotten a ton of results or the complete results yet, but we have 116 votes on this poll I put out. And in this question or this poll I posted to my network, I asked the question of what will be the biggest positive or negative impact of ChatGPT and OpenAI. And just to give you some context of what people are thinking about it, 44% said it would make businesses more efficient. 34% said their data privacy and legal issues. 15% mentioned loss of jobs. And then 7% said something else other, and they comment below. And we'll get to some of those comments here in a moment. But the reason I put this poll out there is because I wanted to get a feel for, how excited people are about the technology versus how much people recognize the dark side or are concerned about the dark side. And certainly the 44% said that it's going to make businesses more efficient. That seems reasonable. But then it was interesting to see that 34% cited data privacy and legal issues as sort of the main thing that was on their mind. So I guess maybe to start there, maybe to use that as a way to set the context for my first question, Marcus, what are some of the legal concerns or unknowns as it relates to ChatGPT and OpenAI? And obviously data privacy and legal issues being one of them. Maybe we could start there and then mention anything else that you think are kind of concerns from your perspective as an attorney.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just generally with respect to OpenAI and ChatGPT, I mean, this is probably an inflection point from a technology standpoint that I don't think we've seen before. I mean, to me, this is as revolutionary as, anything that has come before that just has the ability to transform the way we interact with people, and just the levels of efficiency. And of course, with that kind of power, as they say, comes great responsibility, right? And one of the concerns that I have, if we're going to talk about the dark side, and I do want to talk about some of the efficiencies and some of the positive things about this, because I think they're enormous. But one of the issues with legal regulation and the law as it applies to technology has always been the fact that technology is always 3 to 4 steps ahead of where existing laws and regulations and any kind of regulatory framework exists. So we're always in a scenario where we are catching up. And I think one of the fundamental issues from a legal perspective, and there's so many, okay? I mean, we can talk about this for hours, but one of the things that is problematic is these tools, these systems are being trained on, a corpus of text, of speech, of data, and you don't have necessarily an understanding of what is made up of that body of information. Where are they getting it, for example? Okay. And I think that creates a fundamental risk and a fundamental problem for a variety of reasons. One is, what is the accuracy or the reliability of the output? And we have an old saying in our industry, and it's garbage in, garbage out, right? You put bad data in, you get bad data out. So if there is no control or no regulation or no interest in the accuracy of what this thing is training on, then there's really no guarantee as to the accuracy or the reliability of what you're going to get out, the output of the content that you have created through this tool, and the reliability of that. And that creates substantive issues from just a liability standpoint, from an IP infringement standpoint. And I do think really that is going to be somewhat of a self-regulating issue because, you know, you're going to have different competing products. And if one is less reliable and the results are not as good as another, then people are naturally going to gravitate towards a different product. But I think they're inherent in that is just a lot of substantive risk. I mean, what data is being utilized and how good is the product that you're getting out of it and how do you utilize it? And then downstream, how do you protect the ultimate end user? So for example, if you're a software vendor that's incorporating AI generated content into your products, what kinds of reps and warranties, indemnities and limitations and liabilities are you going to take on with this unknown corpus of data? You know,
Mm.
from a legal perspective, there has been recent litigation, primarily in the IP ownership context. So you've got ChatGPT, or there's another entity, I think it's called DALL-E, where it takes visual representations and creates modifications of that. And there has been at least one notable lawsuit and a couple of others. One filed by Getty, which has all these photographs. The AI tool has gone in, modified pictures of or used as a basis for the generated output, the Getty images, and Getty says, hey, now that's an infringement of our intellectual
Mm.
property rights in those photos, and
Interesting.
that's problematic. I mean, and how as a company do you make representations of non-infringement, indemnity obligations, limit your liability when you don't know what the basis for the data has been?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that lawsuit involving Getty, but I could see how that could be a challenge. And I think when I've thought about data privacy and IP or intellectual property types of issues with these AI platforms, I guess I've thought of it more from the end user perspective. If I'm an employee at a company and I use ChatGPT to have it analyze some sort of sensitive company information, some confidential company information, what happens to that data and that sort of thing. But this is interesting. You're kind of talking about the other side, which I hadn't thought about, which is the model itself using information that's already out there, and then who owns that data and what are the IP implications of that. What about when you are an employee? If I'm an employee at a company or an organization and I use ChatGPT, let's just say I'm trying to use it or I'm testing it out on my day-to-day job. What are some examples or some issues that I might face or be exposed to as it relates to intellectual property and or confidential information? How does that, maybe you could help us understand how that works and what that might look like from a legal perspective?
Yeah, well, I've spent some time in my practice looking at the rules and regulations that are these entities put out there in the context of terms and conditions and what their obligations are to you. And there aren't a lot of them, to be quite honest with you. I mean, they do a very good job at saying, hey, whatever you give to us is not going to necessarily be treated as confidential material. And we are going to be able to use that material in order to you know, iterate our product to make it better. So essentially, whatever you are putting into the AI tool that you're using, you have to make an assumption that it is not going to be treated with any kind of confidentiality. It's not going to be treated as a trade secret. It's going to be open and available to the world. And in fact, Samsung, I think just in the last couple of weeks, had a chat GPT issue where somebody at Samsung disclose some proprietary or confidential information via chat GPT. I think that's a huge concern because they don't take responsibility, chat GPT or any of these open AI platforms. When you're uploading your input into them, it's the Wild West. Essentially, you should have no expectation of privacy, confidentiality, or really very much recourse to get that information back. And I think that's a huge uh, risk for any company. And you can't have some guy in a cube on the other side of the world trying to do a more efficient job, but then having chat GPT, for example, generate substantive pieces of code and then incorporating that code into your generally available product. That those create substantive issues of liability, infringement, and exposure for enterprise customers, and enterprise vendors.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What about, this just occurred to me as you're talking there, Marcus. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the early 2000s when Napster was becoming a thing. And those of you watching or listening that don't remember Napster, it was a platform that was developed that basically allowed you to share music. And it became an issue because obviously there were copyright issues and bands like Metallica. I remember Metallica being kind of leading the charge on this, but Metallica sued Napster because they were creating this platform that allowed people to essentially steal their music, and they weren't getting money for what was rightfully theirs. And ultimately, over time, they sort of won that fight. They won that battle, and Napster is no longer around, I don't think, or maybe they've been wrapped into some other company, but they're not as relevant as they were at one point 20 years ago. But they're sort of a flash in the pan. They sort of came and went because of some of those issues. I don't know that it's necessarily the same thing, or from a legal perspective, it's the same kind of issue. But are these AI platforms or vendors, are they at risk because they're providing a platform that exposes potential confidential information and shares that confidential information? Or is it just sort of like we and organizations as users of that tool, it's just a risk that we just have to deal with? What are your thoughts on that, or how do we balance
I think
that?
it's really both. I mean, I think from the platform's perspective, like I said, they've got these pretty robust terms of use that have been generated by teams of attorneys that really do mitigate their liability and their risk of lawsuits and recourse. And that is being tested in the court system now with a variety of different lawsuits. So certainly, I think if that corpus of material that they use to train their AI on contains proprietary or confidential information that has been accessed without authorization or is being used without express authorization, that creates a risk in the platform, not only to the owners of the platform, the providers of that product, but even to potentially to users. I mean, think about that for a second. As a user of ChatGPT, if you are now generating code that is where that AI tool has been trained on someone's proprietary code that's confidential or protected by an intellectual property right, that the output that you have generated is now infringing, and who's responsible for that infringement? The AI provider attempts to wash their hands of it, and we'll see how successful they are in doing that as these court cases move on. But then what is your liability as the person that generated that code? I mean, the AI provider is going to point at you and say, well, you represented that you had the right to do what you did. You put input in. You're responsible for what comes out. That's not necessarily true. So, I mean, we're at the vanguard of a lot of these legal issues, and it's super, super interesting. And I think there's certainly going to be some trailblazing, legal precedent that comes out of these that's going to define, the parameters of how we all are going to use these systems in the future. So, some of the other issues associated with this too are, I mean, if who owns this output is another fundamental question that really has been clarified, at least to some extent, by the Copyright Office in the last month or so. And the Copyright Office came down on this by saying, if you are inputting information and the output really has no human interaction or control or discretion, that is not protectable from a copyright perspective. It's not protectable intellectual property here at the Copyright Office. So, if you were to go in and say, okay, well, let's do a new painting in the style of Van Gogh and Monet, and now you want to apply for copyright protection, the Copyright Office is going to ask you certain questions about it. And if there is no human interaction or human control over what has come out, they're going to reject it from a protection standpoint, which is in contrast, and this is their example, a graphic novel that has text that is generated by a person, or maybe partially generated by an AI tool, but then edited and vetted and modified by a person with AI images that are generated by AI. There's going to be copyrightable elements to that, and that work would be protectable. Maybe not every element of that work. So, they're coming down with clarity certainly at the Copyright Office and providing guidance to consumers and courts as to what is protectable and what is not.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was not aware of that the Copyright Office of the U.S. government is already providing those parameters. And it leads me to another question here, which is that, you see a lot of governments throughout the world, as you just described in the U.S., the governments are responding fairly quickly. I mean, as fast as governments can move, I suppose. They're responding quickly to this threat or the uncertainty around ChatGPT and OpenAI. In fact, some countries like Italy, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, completely banned ChatGPT and said it's just a platform that it isn't legal in their country. And then I think China just recently, a few days ago, did something similar. So governments, in some cases, are taking more extreme measures and just sort of trying to shut it down or trying to completely control or limit the exposure. I know this is totally, as an attorney, you probably hate this question because I'm asking you to predict the future in a world of uncertainty. But what do you think that'll continue? That trend will continue with U.S. or with global governments getting more and more involved in trying to regulate it, similar to what they're doing right now with cryptocurrency and other things that could be perceived as threats to the sort of the status quo. Do you think that'll continue, or what would your prediction be on that front?
I would expect it to continue in certain jurisdictions. And I think for me, that really is the wrong approach, because I think, just outright banning something without fully realizing the benefits of it, there's a real risk in that your technology industry is going to be left behind. And, once you let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak, you can't really put it back in. And, these things don't necessarily have borders, right? I mean, if you've got Chat GPT that's generally available, people are going to find a way to use it. And certainly if it's providing efficiencies and benefits, from a profitability standpoint, people are going to be clamoring to get their hands on it. And I think the right approach is regulation and, developing a legal framework that is going to mitigate whatever perceived risks are associated with this. And I think they're right certainly in being concerned, and whether we need what we call sui generis protection, which is kind of a bespoke brand new type of compliance system for this, or if we can leverage existing laws. I don't know, maybe there's a mix of both. Maybe some bespoke regulations need to be put in place to govern whatever concerns there are with OpenAI, but I certainly think that a framework that has existed, in law can be applied to this in a substantive way to mitigate risk. But certainly, I mean, you look at implications with respect to banking and healthcare, those are enormous implications, right? I mean, you've got, faulty data that's got biases in it. You've got inaccurate data. I mean, you're talking about, people losing their lives, and you've got, financial crises that could be perpetuated through AI issues. So, I mean, the risks are certainly enormous. And, we talked about, accuracy of the data earlier, who's responsible essentially for policing that, and who is making sure that, the data that is put in is accurate and the output is reliable. There are no, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, and I'm sure somebody here in the chat can correct me. As far as I know, there are no systematic regulations to make that are applicable to AI. And I think what that means then is, from an administrative standpoint, and this is administratively burdensome, but as users, particularly in the corporate context, you've got to regularly assess whether that data is accurate. If you need to know, what type of corpus is being utilized with that particular product that you're using. I mean, is it a private data system? Are they just going out on the internet and scraping data that's generally available? That's going to be problematic from a liability standpoint, potentially. And you need to know that. You have to have an understanding of what those risks are. And then you can craft policies internally to mitigate those risks. I look at this, you referenced Napster, and I think that's a good analogy and that's a good comparison. I look at this almost from kind of an open source context, right? I mean, what are the risks to your enterprise from open source software, and what kind of a program have you put in place to minimize the risks associated with the liability that can be caused by open source software? It's kind of similar in some ways when you're looking at unfettered use by your employees and consultants of OpenAI tools to make them more efficient. How are you going to moderate that? How are you going to mitigate the risks? What policies and regulations as an organization are you going to put in place to govern that kind of thing?
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things there I want to come back to in a second with follow-up questions. One is what you just said about policies you might put in place as an organization. I'll ask that later in the discussion here today. Maybe we'll dive into that. And then I also want to come back to a couple other points you mentioned. But before we do that, I just want to a couple things, Marcus. If you're wondering why no one's saying anything in the chats, because the stream isn't working in the green room that we're in, or the studio we're in right now. So I manually have on my phone, I have LinkedIn open and YouTube as well. So I'm going to have to manually pull the questions. We had the same problem last week. I'm not sure why it's being an issue. So unfortunately, you won't see the questions in advance like you normally would. But before I get to a question here from the audience, I'm just going to go over to the audience here and where people are joining from. We have Ayana from Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for being here today. Subhashish from India. Ashley from Atlanta. Wesley from Colorado. Lars from Charlotte, North Carolina. Just as a few examples here, I'm trying to cherry pick some different countries that people are joining from here today. So thank you all for being here. Really appreciate you appreciate you being here. One of the questions we have here on LinkedIn would be it just came in on LinkedIn. It was sort of related to what you were talking about a second ago, Marcus. I just need to find it because this isn't ideal on my phone and I lost it. Where is it? Bear with me 1 second. Here it is. This is from Emal on LinkedIn. And Emal says, is Marcus comfortable speculating on the kinds of legislation we're likely to see for patenting AI-generated IP? You were sort of talking about that a minute ago as far as what the U.S. Copyright Office is doing. Do you have any other thoughts beyond that? I know you're not an attorney, a global attorney. Your focus is obviously in U.S. law or U.S.-based law. But what are your thoughts on that? Anything else you would add to that thread?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly an interesting question. I mean, I think, is it patentable, and is there a patentability component to these things? I mean, I've really thought about this in the context of the copyright component, and I certainly think that if there is novel output that is being created, it very well could qualify for patentability and protectability. Now, whether that qualifies for patent protection in the United States, I think the hypothetical is just incomplete, so it's hard to say. So I talked about something that lawyers call sui generis protection earlier, and we may get to a point where you've got machines, using machines to create innovative technology, and there may need to be some sort of a program put in place to protect that doesn't really rely on this component that the Copyright Office requires, which is this human intervention and human component to it. So I can definitely see legislation that would expand or clarify the patentability of technology that's being developed through OpenAI sources. So I think that could be something that comes down the pike. But like I said, it's really hard to say, without having specific models and things like that. But it's a real interesting question.
Yeah, for sure. Here's another comment. I'm actually going to pull this comment off of my LinkedIn poll that I mentioned earlier, the poll where I asked, what the biggest positive or negative impact of ChatGPT and OpenAI would be. And in this thread, one person, Jonathan on LinkedIn, chose other. And then when you choose other, I ask people to put in the comments what they think the real issues are. And I'm going to read this comment, even though it's a bit longer. I'll try to condense it a bit here, but it brings up a really good question and something that I don't know that a lot of people have really thought about. Just like a lot of people haven't really thought about the confidentiality and IP issues with ChatGPT. But what Jonathan says in response to the poll is the items you have on the list don't even begin to understand the complexity of issues we face. What about faking people with fake explosive messages, fake videos, propaganda, disinformation, irresponsible know-how, like kids gaining dangerous chemistry know-how, or the floodgates of security threats and exploits by generated code? He goes on to just list a bunch of things that you could use AI for, persuading people into scams, fake family members calling you for cash. You can't tell that it's not a family member. I know
Right.
internally at Third Stage, we just like a lot of companies, we get a lot of phishing scams or attempted phishing scams. And could someone replicate me and create my face or voice and make it sound like I'm saying, "Hey, Marcus, I need you to wire me $1 million right now."
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Do you see that being an issue, or have you seen any issues of that
No, I
recently?
see that as being an enormous issue, and I think that's really an issue from an ethical perspective, right? And there isn't necessarily, you know, I mean, we talk about regulation and a legal framework, and I think that's something that would certainly need to be regulated, in my view, and whether the existing framework of laws and the patchwork of regulations could be applicable to that. I'm sure they can to some extent, but here, I mean, you've got this explosive technology that and we can. I'll use you as an example. I mean, you're pretty available on social media, right? I mean, people know what you look like. They know what your voice sounds like, and I think that someone's ability to fabricate a deep clone of your image and your voice, the cadence with which you speak, your intonations. I'm having trouble with that word. Um, I think that would be pretty easy for one of these OpenAI platforms to replicate. And then all of a sudden, we've got or this deep fake version of you calling somebody, asking them for money, or whatever it is. I mean, I think the ability to clone your voice, mimic speech, cadence, tones. Um, it's really off the charts. And if you look at how a lot of those interactions have taken place from a commercial standpoint to date, I mean, you go onto a website and there's a chat bot that interacts with you, and it's this kind of halting stop and start interaction. Um, that's all going to change fundamentally. And there's the ability to use that for a nefarious purpose, which is the deep fake fraudulent schemes, causing havoc in financial markets, political, crises. But then you look at something as innocuous as Expedia.com, who just integrated a ChatGPT API into their website, where you can just go online and say, "Hey, look, I want to go to Puerto Rico for the weekend. Can you tell me, what flights are going there and what the price range is?" And it just tells you like a normal person. I mean, that's some of the positive, efficient uses of it. But the flip side of that is pretty dark, and pretty scary.
Yeah, yeah, and for a real life example of the power of how someone could potentially use this technology in the nefarious ways you're describing, Marcus, I would invite everyone who is listening in, if you're on TikTok and you haven't already, go check out an account on there called Deep Tom Cruise, and and I've mentioned it before on this podcast. It's a fascinating account. It's actually pretty funny. But it's apparently a software, facial recognition and facial AI, regenerative AI sort of software company that Tom Cruise is somehow involved with. He actually invests in it, or he has an equity stake in the company, from what I understand. So he gave them permission to create this account called Deep Tom Cruise. And it's sort of like a younger version of Tom Cruise, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. It kind of looks like maybe he was in his 30s, or what he looked like 20 years ago. Even though he still kind of looks the same, which is irritating as a middle-aged man. But if you go to this account, you cannot tell, or I cannot tell, that it's not him. And if you watch all the videos, they're pretty funny. His mannerisms, to your point, Marcus, the mannerisms are just like him. He's kind of quirky in the way he talks, and his personality is a little quirky. He's pretty funny in the video, but you cannot tell. I mean, I try really hard to notice some sort of deficiency or inconsistency, and you cannot tell. His voice, his mannerisms, his look, his everything. So I think if you go to that, you look at that, it's fascinating, but also kind of freaky, because I fell for it. When I first saw it, I thought it was Tom Cruise, and you could see someone using that to your advantage.
Oh, I think you extrapolate that to scenarios where you've got a deep fake of that quality of Vladimir Putin, declaring nuclear war on the United States, and
Right.
I mean that those have huge implications, right? And I mean, and if you take it to kind of more of a mundane level, I get a ton of robocalls both on my cell phone and on my work phone, and I have a hard time, every once in a while. determining whether I'm talking to a real person or some sort of, artificial intelligence, and that artificial intelligence is not even that good. I catch myself,
Yeah.
initiating a conversation with them and then realizing, oh, okay, they're just trying to sell me, an extended car warranty or, whatever it is, Medicare or something. I don't know why I get those calls, but, so it's going to really, really blow those things out of the water. And I think we talk about existing regulations. Well, what regulations do you have? Do not call lists and that kind of thing. It's become incredibly easy for these people to inundate you with scams, and the likelihood that you're going to fall victim to those now increases exponentially as well, which is certainly problematic.
So I guess asking a question I already asked you, but asking it in the context of what you just said, who's
Right.
responsible for that from a legal perspective in the future? Or how do you think courts and governments, throughout the world might settle that, or will they settle it? Like, is it my fault if I fall for something like that? Is it the person? Is it obviously it's the criminal's fault, whoever creates the fraud, or there's obviously liability there. But how at fault or at risk are we as people that might fall for it, and or organizations or platforms that enable that sort of activity? Who's how do you allocate the liability, I guess, in this whole equation from your perspective?
Well, I think the owners of these AI tools have to act reasonably, right? And I think there's an effort on their part to do that. And I think as long as they're meeting a certain standard of reasonableness and trying to prevent, the nefarious use of their tools, really that you can only do what you can do, right? And I think if they're not being reckless or they're not being negligent, then I think the liability that they have is probably going to be on the lower end of the scale. I think what you're going to get into a situation where there's a vulnerability in the AI platform that someone is able to exploit, kind of like a hack, and now starts to create something that can be utilized in a bad way. But then you're always going to have a situation where you're going to have criminal organizations or people with ill intent in developing technology that's substantively similar and just as good, that's going to be focused on fraudulent activity. And how do you regulate that? You can't regulate the criminals from not being criminals, right? You can have laws that hold them liable and criminally responsible for those things. But certainly I think you've seen these efforts. I was watching a YouTube video the other day where someone was using I think it was ChatGPT, and they asked it how to make a bomb, and that's against one of its parameters of use, and it said, "Hey, I can't tell you that, sorry." So
Right.
they're putting those kinds of safeguards into the system, but there are certainly I think workarounds, and criminals are certainly creative, and they're going to get around those types of things, and they're going to put those in place certainly.
Yeah, and you sort of allude to something that we started to talk about earlier, which is the inputs into these AI models and who's the arbitrator of truth. And I look to social media right now and the way governments throughout the world, including the U.S. government, where you and I are based, the U.S. government has, in my opinion, sort of overreached on its moderation of discussion and speech on social media. And that's just my personal opinion. I don't want to open a can of worms for people that might agree or disagree with me on that, but that's my personal opinion. So it makes me wonder, if the U.S., which is known for its freedom of speech and that sort of thing, we don't have freedom of speech in the way we used to, and the government has sort of cracked down to determine what it thinks is true and what it thinks is false or misinformation. How do you? I guess I worry a little bit that governments and other powerful bodies, even the AI platforms themselves, the AI vendors themselves, may start to moderate or may start to create these biases to reflect their own personal biases in these AI models. And it just creates a bunch of questions around what is fact, what is opinion, what's the quote unquote right answer. You mentioned that earlier about, these AI models are going out and gathering information that may or may not be true. And it's using that information that may or may not be true to create, outputs that it's feeding to its customers. So do you have any thoughts on that? How do you think that unfolds? I know I'm getting outside the legal realm here, and we'll talk
Yeah.
more about
Well,
social and government stuff, but
I think it's incredibly problematic. I think there's bias exists everywhere, right? And if you've got bias in your data and you've got bias in your team, And the output then is dealt with as true by unsuspecting consumers or users of the technology. I think the implications are vast and incredibly problematic. I mean, you think about things like just diagnosing certain types of healthcare issues, and you think that, well, there's whole populations that are more susceptible to this because of their race or their identity, or whatever it is. I don't want to get
Right.
political either, but if there's bias in that area, it's going to substantively impact how people are diagnosed with disease potentially, right? Or if you think of financial or banking utilization of these tools, who's going to get a mortgage now in what neighborhood and those types of things. I mean, certainly the bias factor can be strong. And how do you regulate that, especially if you're concerned about overregulation? Having images of Tom Cruise is one thing, and certainly with his consent, it's a totally different thing. But how do you stop people from utilizing your images? And there's certainly laws in place to deal with that now. But I think there's got to be some level of regulation as to the quality of the content and the quality of the output. And I think for now, the self-regulation is really kind of where you're at with this. And we'll see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm fascinated by that because I think it's, I think anytime you have something as powerful as OpenAI, ChatGPT, and something that has caught on so quickly, much faster than even cryptocurrency. I mean, cryptocurrency is sort of a mild version of this in terms of the sort of an alternative new platform, a new way of doing things. And you see how the governments throughout the world have reacted to that. They've tried, and they're still trying to find ways to regulate cryptocurrency. And I think with this, anytime you have something like this, the governments just can't help themselves throughout the world. That's their job, I guess, in some ways, is to rein it in. And so you wonder, how are they going to rein this in? What are they going to do? And does that diminish the value, or does that diminish the benefits to society, or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, well, that's always the risk, right? I mean, if you're an Italian right now, you don't even have the benefit of utilizing this technology because the regulation has been so extreme on one side that it's been totally banned, and that's not, to me, it doesn't seem like a well-reasoned approach to dealing with the issues. But I think self-regulation initially and see how it goes, and then government interference to the extent it's necessary or needed, and maybe in only certain industries or regulatory applications of this where would it be necessary.
Right. So here's a follow-up comment to one of your comments earlier, Marcus. This is from Frederick on LinkedIn. Frederick says, looks like Samsung found out by an internal audit that people had done an infringement. ChatGPT didn't go out and post a Twitter post with the information. So in other words, ChatGPT didn't expose that information necessarily or make it public, but the internal audit exposed the fact that people had shared that confidential information. It doesn't change the fact that now that confidential information is part of the OpenAI data set and the data model, and it could be used. Obviously, ChatGPT is not going to go post that information on Twitter, but it is information now that was confidential. It might have been intellectual property that is now part of the OpenAI model. I think that's an important point there.
Yeah, I think it's an important point too. It wasn't a data breach necessarily, right? I mean, it wasn't as if data had been exposed on the internet in an open and conspicuous way, though it had been exposed kind of within the corpus of this data set, and is being utilized potentially by all the users of ChatGPT now. And what is being exposed and what's not being exposed, and how detrimental is it to Samsung in reality, is hard to say. But it can't be a positive thing in any way, shape, or form, right? I mean, and this is why I think we talk about government regulation and then self-regulation of these tools, the owners of these tools. I think as an organization, say you take a Samsung, you've got to have an internal policy. You've got to have internal regulations that are going to govern what your employees can and cannot do. And my understanding is that Samsung had shut down any internal use of ChatGPT, and then I guess there was some pushback internally, or they reassessed that position, thought it maybe wasn't the best position, and then look at what happened, right? But I think as an attorney, and certainly as a former in-house attorney, you really have to look at this with a careful eye, and look at the benefits and the risks because you would like your company to take advantage of the efficiencies, and the business people are going to want to do that. But you've got to assess the risk and put in a regulatory scheme internally that mitigates risks, but also increases the utilization of the tool if you can. And that's not an easy thing to do.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Here's a question from LinkedIn. This is Carolyn on LinkedIn, although I'm wondering if it's really Carolyn. Do we know? I don't know. We'll it might be a deep fake version of Carolyn, but this alleged person named Carolyn, I'm kidding, Carolyn, but she says OpenAI's privacy policy for their paid premium API indicates that they do not use our proprietary data to tune their data model, nor do they store our data. Other than their privacy policy, how can we be assured that our sensitive data is secure? So I guess, first of all, I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of what their privacy policy is, to be honest. So I'm not sure, I can't validate that that is what it says, that they won't use it to tune their data model or store their data. I guess that begs a question of, well, then what's the difference between what they do store and use in their data model versus what they don't store? I'm not sure what the differentiators are. Is that something you're familiar with or have any thoughts on?
Well, I've looked at the ChatGPT / OpenAI terms of use, and my understanding is that it's pretty vague, and there's a lot of nuance and gray area that would allow them to utilize any information that you would submit to be able to at least modify the platform or make it more efficient. But I certainly I think the bright line rule here for me as an attorney, regardless of even what the terms of use say, if you're going to be submitting information that is confidential or proprietary or trade secret into this system, that is a fool's errand right there. That is not something that you should be doing or allowing as a company, encouraging your employees to do. And there should be some restriction internally that you impose as a company to prevent that from happening. Because to me, I think the likelihood that that information is going to be utilized in some way is very high. And I think the risk to the company, you don't know what it is. I mean, I think in the Samsung example, you have a scenario where, you've got information that's part of the corpus, and it's being, utilized in some way, shape, or form. How substantively, I don't know. I mean, talk to Getty Images, and they're certainly not happy that their proprietary copyrighted photographs have been part of or incorporated into the corpus and are being utilized to generate images. What's the infringement from a real practical perspective right there? In some ways, it doesn't matter because there's statutory liability, and I think that the total damages that they're seeking is something like $12 million. So the risks and the perceived risks are really maybe don't equal or aren't the same, but certainly from a liability and risk perspective, you've got to manage it and mitigate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great point. And it's a lot of what we're talking about here today seems to come back to a common theme, which is we don't really know. We're talking about a lot of uncertainty and a lot of speculation of what might happen in the future. Some of this has already happened, but I'd say, there's probably 90% or more of this that we haven't really figured out or settled yet as it relates to ChatGPT.
Right. And, one of the things that we haven't talked about that's directly related to the Samsung incident and the utilization of this information is, what do you do as an organization when you have a huge, data set of user information? Let's say, you're a company that's utilizing, AI, and you're using a software product that incorporates AI to analyze, user end user, data, confidential information, proprietary information, personally identifiable information, and that's being utilized in the data set. What are your obligations with respect to GDPR? Some of the other privacy regulations, and what are not only what are your responsibilities, but what are your liabilities with respect to doing that? And certainly, I think GDPR would say that you've got to be transparent and you've got to get consent, and you need to certainly let people know if there's an automated decision making with respect to their personally identifiable information. But the liability associated with utilizing all of that data You know, and it could be something as innocuous as using, OpenAI to get, market analysis or just user data in general, statistics on how they're using your products, but you're now utilizing personally identifiable information and you're putting that into the AI system. That is problematic, I would think.
Yeah, you mentioned a great point with GDPR in Europe, which is the data privacy law that was enacted a few years ago in the EU. And that's a great point. I mean, you've got GDPR regulations that sort of limit, what can or can't be shared or used in this way. What kind of confidence do you have that these OpenAI models and ChatGPT and Google's Bard and any other AI platform like this, how confident would you be that they are compliant with GDPR and other privacy laws?
Well, I'm not so sure that they're the way you utilize these tools. It's really, if you're going to be putting in the personally identifiable information into the tool, you're the one that needs to be compliant with the regulations that are governing your use of your customers' personally identifiable information or data. And so, I'm not so sure that it's really a question of, how compliant is ChatGPT necessarily. What does it allow you to do with personally identifiable information? Can it identify it? Does it preclude the use of that information? That's one question. But if you've got, some sort of an OpenAI application or tool that you're utilizing in connection with your business, and you're trying to use that tool to analyze your customer data, what obligations do you have? And do you have an understanding of how that data is being used within that tool set? Again, are you putting out, personally identifiable information into a corpus of data that's now going to be analyzed by this, OpenAI system? That's certainly, a big deal and a problem, something that you need to be aware of.
Right. Yeah. And it's a great point. Carolyn on LinkedIn, by the way, just for those that are wondering, she did confirm that it really is her. So it must be true then. If she came back electronically and told me it's her, I've got to believe her, right?
Right.
Now I'm going to be skeptical. Anytime I see anyone on social media or even a video, I'm going to be skeptical of whether it's really them. Here's a comment from, or a question from Sam Graham on LinkedIn. Sam says, sometimes perception is reality. If enough people believe false information that ChatGPT publishes, is there a danger of that causing actions that we wouldn't want? For example, if it said that vitamin C was bad for us, the results would not be good. What are your thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I think that is problematic because, that's about the accuracy and the truth of what the output is. And, if you've got bias and bad data that is, replicating within that system, and you're getting, output that's just not correct, how do you police against that? How do you make sure that, people's confidence in the accuracy of the data is where it needs to be? Again, the implications associated with that are pretty enormous, right? I mean, you've got, facts coming out that saying, something isn't good for you when in fact it is. And the perception certainly is the reality.
Right. So I guess just to sort of put a bow on this or wrap this all together, we've talked about a lot of uncertainty. We've talked about what we think might happen in the future. We've talked about some of the landscape of what some of the risks are. But what closing recommendations would you have for organizations that are concerned about the potential downside of ChatGPT? You mentioned before policies that organizations might put in place. I mean, what would you do if you're giving us advice, as an attorney, and you're our corporate counsel, which you actually are, third stage is corporate counsel. But if you were a corporate counsel to others on the call here today, what would you suggest they do to navigate this uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat similar to some of the things that we say when you're trying to adopt ERP software and technology in general. Okay, I mean, you can't do this out of kind of a FOMO mentality, right? You can't be an organization that says, "Hey, we want to implement, AI and incorporate it into our systems to make use of the efficiencies that we believe are there." You have to have a solid and legitimate business case for utilizing that piece of technology, just like any other technology. it's got to make sense for your business, right? And then once you have determined that there is a business case to use a particular AI tool, you want to make sure that you have an understanding of how the vendor or the provider of that tool trains their AI product. What data is it using? Is it, general data on the internet? Is it proprietary information that only they have access to? What's the quality of that information? All of those are key components that you need to make a determination of, right? And then you've got to, in my view, do the necessary due diligence to make it to have an understanding of what kind of intellectual property rights do you need to utilize the AI tool? Okay, what kind of intellectual property representations and warranties do you need to flow down to any end users or customers that are going to use products that are associated with or generated by or incorporate the AI technology? And then, once you've got kind of that framework in place as to what your risks and liabilities are and how you're going to mitigate them, what's the use policy, for utilizing the AI platform? And I think you've got to think about that in two ways. One is there's going to be a different appetite for risk and risk tolerance if you're utilizing AI internally, like Samsung, okay, or you're utilizing it externally, like Microsoft, right, or Google or something. I mean, those are two fundamental different use cases, and they carry fundamentally different risk mitigation models. And you might have kind of a dual track where you're using it internally to increase your own efficiencies, and then you're using it externally in order to generate more revenue and provide better customer experiences or whatever. I think those are really the fundamental things. I mean, there's other implications, with respect to, mergers and acquisitions. I mean, if you're acquiring companies, you need to understand, what kind of AI components they might have embedded in their products, how they're utilizing those, what the risk to your organization is once you complete that merger or acquisition. And then again, I'll come back to, how, we talked about reps and warranties from a contractual perspective, that you're going to flow down to your end users, but what about just documents in general that you've signed? What's your limitation of liability? What kind of reps and warranties have you made to other companies regarding, the use of intellectual property, your ownership of intellectual property, and does that need to be modified? I mean, this is not a mature area, right? Even when you look at the terms of use that these AI tools put out, they're not drafted in a way that accommodates every kind of, potential scenario. And so you as a user have to take on this level of due diligence to make sure that you've got the proper scheme in place internally to mitigate the risk and to maximize the use and efficiency of these tools to take advantage of them.
Right. Yeah, that's well said. I hadn't thought about the difference between internal use and the public facing use or customer facing use of these tools, and recognizing the need to treat those differently and mitigate risk differently depending on what the purpose is or what the use of the product is. I think in some cases, like I'll give you an example just from my personal experience. I know that there's parts of our team at third stage that are using ChatGPT, and I didn't tell them to. It's not a policy that you need to use it. We didn't decide to roll it out company wide or anything like that. It's a technology that anyone can go use, just like Google. I don't tell people to use Google, but they do. They use it when they need to go find something or they're looking for something. And similarly, people are using ChatGPT in that way. But we've started to reinforce the caution that needs to be applied here, both in terms of information that might get leaked, but also not relying too much on ChatGPT, because just like Google, we're not going to go Google best practices for how to make a digital transformation successful. That's not what we do. It's based on our experience and that sort of thing. But we might augment that experience with information we find there. But we also have to recognize that just because it's on the internet, just because it's on ChatGPT, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And so you have to take it with a grain of salt. And so I think just education is a big part of it too, and making sure that in addition to having policies in place, that people are educated of what these risks are, and just how you need to be careful with some of that information.
Absolutely. I mean, and the risks are pretty big. It could be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we didn't talk about this at the beginning of the interview. I think we were both so excited to jump into this topic, we glossed over it. But maybe tell us just quickly a little bit about your, sort of your law practice and what it is you do personally, as well as what TAF does, and maybe just let us know how we can get a hold of you if anyone's interested in chatting with you more about this topic,
Yeah.
or they're concerned about it, or want to bounce ideas off you. How they get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you can go to TAF Law. I'm on there. Marcus Harris. I'm on LinkedIn. You've got a YouTube channel. I mean, I think Marcus Harris Attorney is the easiest way to find me. Unfortunately, you got to put attorney because there's a couple of athletes that rank a lot higher than I do. So, but regardless, my practice is really focused on intellectual property and technology issues. General intellectual property issues, and certainly enterprise software related issues, from litigation to contract drafting and negotiating. And so we're at the forefront of a lot of these data privacy issues, and certainly issues just like this that are starting to come up more and more in our practice and really impact our clients in a big way. And the approach that we have to all of this is it's not the Italian approach where you just say no. It's really an approach where let's get to yes. Let's figure out how to mitigate the risks in a manageable way to get you as a business or a consumer to utilize what you need to use. But as long as you're aware of what you're getting yourself into and we can mitigate it, that's the way we like to approach these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's well said, that's why you're such a perfect guest for this topic, because of your intellectual property focus and background, as well as your software technology background and focus as well. So I imagine in the next few months you're going to have a lot more to talk about as you get more engaged in resolving some of these issues for more and more organizations that you work with, or more and more clients that you work with. So we might have to do a touch point here later in the year to see where we are. Any new updates on this whole ChatGPT OpenAI thing? But thank you very much for being here today, Marcus. Really appreciate your time. Appreciate the audience chatting or providing the questions. Sorry about the technical issues getting to some of those questions, but hopefully we got to some of the main ones that you all had. Again, this interview will become part of the episode of Transformation Ground Control that gets released a week from tomorrow. Again, you can find Transformation Ground Control streaming on Wednesdays to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And the audio podcast version drops to Google, Amazon, Apple Podcast, all those different podcast platforms on Wednesdays as well. So be sure to check out that podcast if you don't already. Want to thank you all for being here. We do these live streams, same time, same place every week. So I encourage you to check us out. Next week, we'll have Dominic Lynn, who's from the Third Stage Consulting Europe office. We're going to talk about a case study with one of our European clients. So we'll be chatting through that with him next week. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check us out every Tuesday, same time, same place. Thank you all for being here. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you all soon. And thanks again, Marcus.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.